In the introduction of A Streetcar Named Desire, the action opens in an area of New Orleans called Elysian Fields. A refined-looking former schoolteacher named Blanche DuBois comes to visit her sister Stella and brother-in-law Stanley Kowalski, who live in a first-floor apartment. Blanche waits alone in the apartment for her sister to arrive, sneaking a drink of liquor. Stella soon arrives and greets her sister warmly. Blanche reveals that their family lost their home, a plantation called Belle Reve, from the French meaning beautiful dream. Then Stanley arrives. Blanche's demure air contrasts sharply with his crude working-class manners. Stanley soon confronts Blanche about the plantation. Blanche shows Stanley her business papers that show it was lost because its mortgage was foreclosed. Somewhat appeased, Stanley lets slip that Stella is pregnant. In the rising action, Stanley and his friends Mitch, Steve, and Pablo play poker in the kitchen. Stanley is annoyed because he's losing, and he eventually explodes and beats Stella. Stella and Blanche leave the apartment and go to Eunice's apartment on the second floor. Stanley's friends calm him down. A remorseful Stanley bursts outside and cries out repeatedly for Stella! She comes down. She and Stanley embrace, and Stanley carries her into the bedroom. While Stanley is out, Blanche tries to convince Stella to leave her husband because of the horrible way he treats her. But Stanley returns to the house and secretly overhears their conversation. Stanley and Blanche's dislike for one another becomes a simmering feud. Meanwhile, Blanche and Stanley's friend Mitch becomes romantically serious. Blanche explains to Mitch that years earlier she married a young man, but she caught her husband in a sexual situation with another man. Blanche told him that he disgusted her, so her husband went outside and shot himself dead. Mitch says it sounds as if both he and Blanche need somebody. They kiss. But Stanley tries to derail their burgeoning courtship by telling Mitch about Blanche's sordid past. Blanche had affairs with several men, and she became notorious in her hometown. Also, Blanche had sex with one of her high school students, and when the school administration found out, they fired Blanche from her teaching position. At Blanche's sad birthday dinner, Mitch does not show up, and Stanley gives Blanche a birthday present in the form of a one-way ticket back to Laurel. Then, Stella feels birth pains and tells Stanley to take her to the hospital. When Blanche is alone in the apartment, Mitch, who is half drunk, visits and tells Blanche she isn't clean enough to bring home to his mother. Blanche screams, and Mitch leaves. In the climax of the play, Stanley comes back from the hospital to get some sleep, and he mocks Blanche and calls her a liar. He attacks her, then forces her onto the bed and rapes her. In the following action, Blanche becomes mentally unstable. And in the resolution of the play, Stella makes arrangements to take Blanche to a state mental hospital. She couldn't believe Blanche's story about Stanley raping her because Stella wants to preserve her marriage. Stella sobs uncontrollably as a doctor leads her sister away. Stanley tries to soothe his wife, who will not be consoled. The dramatic play, A Streetcar Named Desire, tells the story of desire and disaster of four primary characters: Blanche DuBois, her sister Stella, Stella's husband Stanley Kowalski, and Stanley's friend Mitch. Blanche DuBois comes from a formerly wealthy Southern family that owned a plantation called Belle Reve. Raised as a refined lady, Blanche does not cope well with life's harsh realities and feels she needs a man to protect her. Blanche uses desire and illusion to suppress the reality of death and loss. When Blanche was young, she married a man who committed suicide when Blanche rejected him for being homosexual. Since then, Blanche has had affairs with several men, including a 17-year-old boy, in an attempt to escape the trauma caused by the death of her husband. When Blanche arrives at the apartment of her sister Stella and her husband Stanley Kowalski in New Orleans, she's a desperate woman who's lost everything. Still, she keeps up her Southern Belle act to protect herself from the harsh world and to get a man to marry her. Blanche's ladylike affections clash with gruff Stanley's crude manners, and they come to hate each other. Eventually, Stanley confronts Blanche and rapes her. As a result, Blanche becomes mentally unstable. Stanley Kowalski lives with his wife Stella in a small apartment in New Orleans. Stanley is a crude, domineering man who's physically imposing and sees himself as the ruler of his family. When Stanley feels this power structure is threatened, he can become violent, throwing things and even beating Stella. Even so, Stanley has a strong sexual and emotional bond with his wife. When Blanche comes to stay with him and Stella, Stanley clashes with her. Stanley loves down-to-earth ideas, is bluntly honest, and often relies on physical intimidation. Stanley hates what he perceives as Blanche's superior attitude toward him and sees her as a threat to his family order. As a result, he uncovers the truth about Blanche's sexual history in Laurel and uses it against her, then rapes her. Stella Kowalski is Stanley's wife and Blanche DuBois' younger sister. Stella is more practical and adaptable than Blanche, willing to cast aside her upper-class affectations to marry Stanley, a crude working-class man. Stella acts as a mediator between Blanche and Stanley. She loves them both. She refuses to believe Blanche's story about being raped by Stanley. If Stella did believe it, she would not be able to live with her husband. Instead, Stella betrays her sister, helping Stanley get rid of Blanche by sending her to a mental institution. Mitch is Stanley Kowalski's good friend. He served in the army with Stanley and works for the same company. Mitch is single and lives with his sick mother, and he has an innate kindness and gentleness. He believes Blanche's Southern Belle act and falls in love with her. Blanche likes Mitch and wants to marry him so he will protect her. When Stanley tells Mitch the truth about Blanche's sexual history in Laurel, Mitch becomes disillusioned and bitter, refusing to marry her. In the end, he tries to prevent Stanley from forcing Blanche to leave, but his attempt proves futile, and he remains a broken man dominated by Stanley. Desire, destruction, and death. Truth versus illusion. Repression and dependence. Class differences. Passion and sexuality. These complex themes underscore the relationships that drive the action of the play, A Streetcar Named Desire. The play's four major characters, Blanche, Stanley, Stella, and Mitch, are driven by a variety of desires that almost always lead to their destruction, and to the destruction of those around them. For example, Blanche is torn between conflicting desires of finding romantic love and marriage that will protect her from life's harsh realities. But her husband's death has driven her to sexual promiscuity and drinking that drives her away from these things. Blanche often resorts to lies to prevent other people, and possibly herself, from seeing the truth, which ultimately leads to her destruction. Stanley's greatest desire is to maintain his dominant position as head of the family, but his marriage to Stella is an ongoing cycle of sexual desire and violence. When Blanche threatens his domination of his family, Stanley decides to destroy her by exposing her past and by raping her. Truth versus illusion is a theme mostly playing out through Blanche and Stanley. Blanche has trouble looking at the unvarnished truth. Because of this, she lives in the dimly lit world of half-truths and illusion, hiding behind her refined, often manipulative Southern manners. But Stanley is bluntly honest and crude, and he despises lying, but has no compassion for others. He uses the truth as a weapon to control and destroy Blanche. For Stella, compassion overrides truth, and she believes her sister's behavior is understandable, considering the tragic outcome of Blanche's marriage. In the end, Stella chooses illusion over truth in order to preserve her marriage. Repression and dependence speak to the play's context, a time when women were expected to be dependent on men, both financially and emotionally, a dependence that dictated the course of their lives. The death of her young husband and the loss of her family home have made Blanche especially vulnerable. And Stella's financial, emotional, and sexual dependence on her husband Stanley traps her in a life with a horrible man who abuses her and rapes her sister. Class differences are depicted through the characters' clashing social classes. Blanche bases her identity on being a refined Southern belle who appreciates the finer things in life. Stella has left her upper-class background behind to join Stanley. Blanche sees her sister's choice as a big step down in social status, but low-class Stanley rips away Blanche's mask of superiority. This confirms Blanche's view of him as no better than an animal, represented by the inhuman jungle voices and lurid reflections when he rapes her. Passion and sexuality of characters in the play reflects the way they view the world. Blanche's sexual exploits are a way for her to escape the reality of her husband's suicide and the role she played in it. Stanley exudes a confident animal sexuality that binds him to his wife, Stella. Stella is possessed by a need to fulfill that sexual passion for Stanley. But Stanley also uses sexuality as a weapon, raping Blanche in order to dominate her. Light and flowers are the key symbols sprouting up throughout A Streetcar Named Desire and illuminating the character's motives and actions. Both dim and harsh light is used to underscore the theme of truth versus illusion. Dim light symbolizes Blanche's world of illusion because it helps to disguise the truth about herself. For example, she asks Mitch to place a paper lantern over a bulb to dim the glaring light in order to hide her true age. Later, Mitch mentions to Blanche that she refuses to be seen in the harsh glare of the sun. He finds this suspicious because I've never had a real good look at you. Blanche worries that if Mitch knows her real age or the details of her life in Laurel, he won't marry her. In contrast, harsh light represents the naked truth, especially as seen by Stanley and Mitch. When Mitch wants to find out Blanche's age, he removes the paper lantern, exposing Blanche to the harsh light of the naked light bulb. Blanche finds this action insulting, but Mitch sees it as truthful. Blanche believes a woman should be allowed deceit to protect her vanity, and a gentleman should understand this need. However, for Mitch and Stanley, the main goal is to expose the facts, plain and simple. To show this, author Tennessee Williams has the Kowalski apartment lit with glaring light. Soon after Blanche arrives at the apartment, she tells Stella to turn off the overhead light because I won't be looked at in this merciless glare. Blanche carries many unpleasant truths within herself she would prefer not to see. Flowers is the other key symbol. The title of the play establishes a connection between desire and death or loss or destruction. The Streetcar Named Desire brings Blanche to another streetcar called Cemeteries, and then to Elysian Fields, a Greek reference to the afterlife. Blanche blames the sexual escapades of her ancestors for the loss of Belle Reve. Blanche's sexual escapades led to the loss of a job and her reputation. Blanche's husband kills himself after his affair with another man is discovered. Finally, Blanche loses her sanity after she is raped by Stanley. The flowers in the play become the perfect symbol for this connection between desire and death. Stella compliments Blanche's desirability, saying, "You are fresh as a daisy." Yet Blanche references death in her reply, "One that's been picked a few days." Mitch brings Blanche roses as an expression of his desire for her, just as Blanche's inappropriate flirtation with the young man collecting newspaper payments ends. And when Mitch and Blanche have a falling out, a Mexican woman appears selling flowers for the dead. The motifs of the Blue Piano, It's Only a Paper Moon, the Varsouviana Polka, and Belle Reve set the mood and further define the themes of the play A Streetcar Named Desire. The term blue piano suggests the blues, mournful music often written in response to life's hardships and tragedies. The music of the blue piano, which opens and closes the play, is often heard during particularly pointed, sad, or tragic moments. The blue piano grows louder as Blanche admits to Stella that Belle Reve is lost, and again as Blanche flirts desperately with a young man. Later in the play, the blue piano's music grows louder until it turns into the roar of a train as Stanley prepares to rape Blanche in a painfully tragic scene. The song It's Only a Paper Moon appears only once in the whole play, when Blanche sings it while taking a bath in scene 7, as Stanley reveals Blanche's sexual exploits to Stella. Its lyrics focus on one of Blanche's struggles to deal with truth versus illusion, but it wouldn't be make-believe if you believe in me. Lyrics like that in the song reveal Blanche's reliance on illusion to help her find true love. She believes that manipulative flirtation and hiding the truth about her sexual escapades is the only way to secure romantic, protective love. The Varsouviana Polka symbolizes the combination of desire, destruction, and death that haunts Blanche, beginning with her husband's suicide. This polka begins playing when Blanche describes the death of her husband, when Stanley gives Blanche a ticket back to Laurel, where her life had fallen apart after she is caught having sex with one of her teenage students, and when the doctor and matron arrive to take Blanche away in scene 11. Blanche, toward the end, gets this polka stuck in her head. Belle Reve is a plantation that represents the traditional lifestyle of upper-class Southern landowners. However, characters in the play react to this setting in different ways. For Blanche, Belle Reve, her former home, relates to her agonizing attempt to hang on to a refined way of life. The plantation's name is French for beautiful dream. Even after Belle Reve has been lost, Blanche clings to traditional Southern values as if she still lived there. Stella feels only some guilt about leaving Belle Reve. She cries when Blanche accuses her of not helping to keep the plantation. Blanche is angry not only about the loss of the estate, but also about having to abandon the way of life the estate represents. Stanley doesn't care at all about Belle Reve representing Southern tradition. For him, Belle Reve just means money. He and Stella did not get any money from the sale of Belle Reve, which upsets him until he realizes the property was lost due to a foreclosed mortgage.